In 2016, the Vote Leave campaign broke UK law by breaching election campaign spending limits. In 2018, advertising by the Victorian Liberal Party impersonated the independent Australian Electoral Commission. In 2020, the outgoing US president and many political representatives refused to acknowledge the official results of national elections. Then in January 2021, the nation's Capitol building was occupied for the first time in the country's history. On 1st February, Myanmar's military staged a coup, declaring the results of the elections in November invalid. In July, the UK government passed new legislation which effectively makes many forms of peaceful protest prospectively illegal. These are just a few examples of the decline of democracy that we are witnessing almost daily. Even worse, in my view, has been the full frontal assault on science, logic and reason by some major media outlets, influential public figures and political leaders. Wherever you look, the telltale sign that malignant forces are at work is hypocrisy, saying one thing publicly and doing the exact opposite in private as political activists seek to replace long trusted power structures with new autocratic regimes. In Democracy in Decline, we will stare these forces in the face and explore what we can each do to combat them. Though the subject matter is dark, as always, ESGX Live will be uplifting, down to earth and interactive. Register at esgx.org to join our live audience, ask your own questions and contribute your perspectives. Finally, from me, Nigel Lake in New York, and my co-host Paul Herman in San Francisco, a sincere thank you to our ongoing sponsors, Pottinger and Hit Investor. We very much look forward to the discussion. Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education and information to inspire collaboration and action on all things to do with sustainability. With me, Nigel Lake, here in New York, and my co-host in San Francisco, Paul Herman. We have a fantastic discussion coming up today on the dark subject of democracy in decline, which I very much hope will inspire us all that things in some ways are not as bad as you might think, but there is an enormous amount we all need to do in order to guard the democracies that we have, to improve them and perhaps shine that or bring that benefit more broadly around the world. You know, I certainly reflect myself on what has happened, in the US through the electoral cycle. We won't dwell on that today. It's been well documented, but you've seen significant developments in the UK, which will be concerning in countries like Australia, and of course, far worse things in other parts of the world. So with that as the introduction, let me hand over to Julie Kane, who is going to lead us through the discussion today. And I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you for that great introduction. As we saw in that dark video, rising democracies have been crushed and existing democracies have degenerated into dictatorships. Both The Economist and Freedom House have published studies showing more countries are moving away from democracy than are moving toward it. Authoritarian populists are on the rise, and citizens around the world have become disillusioned and angry with their governments. Today's panel is here to discuss the threats to democracy globally, how we can act to combat them, and what positive role can individuals, companies, investors, and governments play to reverse these trends. One of our special guests is Lisa Witter. She is the CEO of Apolitical Foundation, a nonprofit that advances democracy and transforms political leadership with a global learning network used by public servants in more than 170 countries. We also have Stephen Young, the executive director of the Co-Roundtable for Moral Capitalism, and he also serves on the board of New Day Impact, which uses these principles in stakeholder capital impact investments. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Richard Rikoski, the chief economist at Democracy Investments, which has developed a democracy-weighted index strategy that tilts towards investments in democracies and away from authoritarian states. So if I could invite the panelists to turn on their video. Excellent. Steve? So let's go ahead and get started. let's start with Lisa. Lisa, you're based in Berlin. What trends are you seeing in Europe, and what are the glimmers of hope?
I would say the trends. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be with you. And I'm really excited about this conversation, sort of the intersection of where democracy and markets come together. I feel it's fresh. And later, I hope to be talking about the role of the private sector, and particularly private sector thinking, and how we can restore democracy. So thanks for this context, and for all of you for caring enough to show up. I don't know if you can see over my shoulder right here, but there's something that has gone on. You can see it where I'm pointing to. Something went on in Germany this weekend, which was an election. For the first time in 16 years, that's Angela Merkel there painted. The first time in 16 years, we will eventually have a new chancellor, and we had a very robust democratic turnout, although it looks like lower than before in Germany with a change of party in the first time, but new parties, lots of activity in the space. What I see going on, I see democratic decline happening almost everywhere. There's really, obviously, the scenes that you talked about, Julie, in the US were quite stark, right, with the storming of the Capitol. But there is concern all over Europe about this democratic decline, particularly in lack of inclusion of people who aren't part of the system already. So just take in Berlin, we have 30% of the people who live in Berlin couldn't vote in the elections because of electoral laws, and that is not democratic. I'd love to get to the point coming up about where we see bright spots in changing that, where the positive trends in politics are going. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Lisa. Rick, you recently done some work in Afghanistan. Can you speak to your recent experience?
Sure. Thanks, Julie. I got pulled in to help evacuate the Afghan girls robotics team around August 15th, and I got them a free plane. They didn't use it. The Qataris got them out. So suddenly I became everyone's best friend, and a group of us ended up joined together and creating what became the Female and Free Speech Airlift. There was a lot of effort to get translators out, people who'd worked with the US government, embassy staffers, et cetera. Not a lot of effort, though, to get out the people who really adopted our values, whether that was women who went to school and got jobs and became professors, people who were pro-democracy, a lot of academics. So we were really focusing on them, but we were getting everybody else out. And so we've been doing that for the better part of a month. And it's been a pretty interesting learning experience to sort of tie it back to the investing world. I kind of like what Alan Greenspan said about why the US has a strong economy. And it's that we were founded by Puritans, and we tell the truth, we honor our deals, and so you don't have to bake huge risk premiums into things because people aren't going to default. And you contrast that with Afghanistan, which seems to have several thousand years of bad habits ingrained in them. There's a culture of dishonesty. There's a lot of corruption. The country's overrun with con men. And we were sort of the perfect rubes to just walk in there and get taken. I don't really understand how it was ever going to work, but it's interesting to see that same pattern in other post-communist countries, because about half the communist countries launched and became democracies, and about the other half really didn't, and they sank deeper into authoritarianism. And this is a common theme. So seeing Afghanistan fail is not really that unexpected. Because for a lot of countries after authoritarian rule, you think you need to engage in nation building, but what you really need to do is engage in character building and rebuild the national character after it's been destroyed.
Well said, Rick. Thank you. Now, Steve, you wanted to comment about things in the Middle East?
Well, I'd like to comment on a number of things. This is such a huge topic, and I think Rick just made one of the most important points that we all need to have in mind when we talk about anything political. The American phrase these days is that politics is downstream from culture. when Rick was talking about you have to sort of create or recreate a character structure, I think that's absolutely true. And so whether democracy is getting stronger or democracy is getting weaker, we probably ought to, as analysts, the very first thing is to go up a level to what's going on with culture, with values, with people's sense of who they are. We've done some work at the Co-Roundtable looking at Islam and Quran and democracy. Because at the Co-Roundtable, the concern of some of the business leaders was, quite frankly, that business cannot prosper and cannot succeed in countries which are very corrupt. And most countries which are very corrupt are not particularly democratic. They don't listen to the people. They listen to a leadership, and cronyism, crony capitalism, rent extraction is financing this elite. So the Co-Roundtable sort of founders who had ethical principles for business asked, what about ethical principles for government? And sort of, we have law, but what's the ethics, the character of good government? And that got us interested with some colleagues at a Muslim university in Malaysia, International Islamic University, on are there value structures in Quran which have been there a long time, which may not have been developed by the elites, but which could create the moral basis for open systems. And there's a lot of similarities, frankly, between Quran and John Locke's theory of representative democracy. But let me stop there, because then I start getting into the weeds.
Thank you, Steve. Lisa, anything you'd like to add? I saw your GDP.
Yeah, I wanted to, I like Steve, I like your weeds, and I think we need to get into the weeds to get out of the weeds. And I just really want to echo, I think what there's so much that needs to be picked apart with this topic. I mean, one, when you talk about government, often people think that politics and government are the same thing. In many places, you have career civil servants who aren't always obviously they have to listen to the political mandate, but they often operate on most issues separate from the political agenda. So politics and government can be different things, and I want to be a little bit careful about that. And it's really easy to demonize politicians because there's a bad politician here, but it doesn't mean all politicians are bad. So I just think we want to be careful about the conversation. But back up to the meta, I do think you're on to what we're seeing. What I think is part of the issue is that we haven't gone back to first principles, particularly in how technology and globalization has changed the way we live. So we're trying to do democracy. Like, for example, my point about Berlin, 30% of people live here who can't vote because they're not citizens of Germany or citizens of the European Union. We have migration. We have a world that's changed because of technology, but our democratic structures haven't reflected that. And we're not asking ourselves the first principle, whether in government or politics, what do we want? Like, what sort of society do we want, and how are we going to do that? So it sounds very hypothetical, but I think you're really right to look at the culture piece to drive that democratic outcome. Thanks, Steve.
Rick, you've done some research looking at trends in democracy in terms of GDP and population. If you could speak to that.
Well, there's several different ways you can analyze the state of global democracy. You can look at it, the Economist, when they prepare the democracy index every year, sort of averages all the countries together, and they're like, Asia improved this year because Taiwan went up a lot. And Taiwan's not the biggest country in Asia. So you can average countries together, but I've been looking at different ways, including weighing averages based on population. And if you do that, instead of Asia going up, Asia's going down. Or you can weigh it using GDP, right? And if you do either population weighted or GDP weighted, you can show pretty much globally that democracy has been kind of in a recession globally. And regions which have been going backwards quickly include Eastern Europe, Asia, and North Africa and the Middle East. For at least the stuff I was tracking, I wasn't tracking the rest of Africa. Interestingly, though, the Americas have been doing fairly well, as has been Western Europe. It's not so bad. And then the last thing I was looking at is if you actually do market cap weighted. So you say, where's the money? Where's the investment? Where are people pushing their resources? And it turns out that the average dollar invested is going more and more towards authoritarian states globally. If you look at it in Western Europe, again, in the Americas, it's not so bad. And in fact, when I did it, because this is based on our democracy investments index, which is an ex-US index. If you want to look at it on our website, you can. We don't include the US. So I did ex-US for the Americas. And surprisingly, Canada all by itself single-handedly pulls everybody up in the rankings because Canada has a juggernaut of an economy. But the trends for market cap weighted are very, very bleak in North Africa and the Middle East, where the average dollar is now basically going to an authoritarian state. And so when you think about how you're investing, your dollars are driving these trends. And I think that what we need is to develop a large system of incentives that can basically push countries towards democracy.
Yes. And Steve, you've done a lot of work at looking at metrics as well. Would you like to add to that?
But I'd like to go back to the first point and history. And one of the things that I'm increasingly kind of uneasy about, to be frank with our audience and everybody else, is from my personal experience, and I'm not as young as I used to be, that a lot of younger people really don't know a lot about history. And these arguments going back to the 18th and 19th century and the early 20th century, linking the rise of democracy with middle classes, this was a very Marxist approach. If you want to get a sort of a democratic system, you need to have a certain kind of economic substructure, some kind of a middle class. And the link and sort of the surprise to a lot of intellectuals in America about China, as Rick was talking about, was that China over the last 20, 30 years has developed a very large, in terms of headcount, middle class. But this is not a middle class, which is a classical Western European middle class, which is autonomous from state and party control. The implication of this, I think, is looking very much at economic structures as to what extent they feed rent extraction and support a kind of dominant elite, which you have with when countries have focus on the extraction of natural resources, the curse of having a lot of oil or a lot of diamonds or something like that. On the other hand, a lot of countries which have very low wage populations, very poor countries, it's easy to sort of organize those people because in neither situation do you have a strong autonomous middle class, which has its own values, its own social organizations, and its own economic wealth to be able to hold off the demands of other elites. So I think there's a deeper lesson here for democracy somewhere about the middle, which goes back in Western thinking to Aristotle's notion of a golden mean. In the Confucian tradition, you have the doctrine of the mean, which is always talking about finding the mean, where there's balance and perspective, and people are therefore empowered with their own agency to make their own way in life.
And yet we've seen dictators use social media to keep the middle class from communicating. It's all over the press, the disinformation and the destroying free media and silencing opposition.
Well, Julie, sorry, it's even more than that. I'm so interested, Steve, in your comments about China and the middle class. And it's, history is not written, so it remains to be seen how China holds, right? Whether the middle class is actually going to stay where they're at or whether there will be a revolt. I think different people have different points of view, but we look a lot, I co-chair for the World Economic Forum, the Agile Governance Council, and so we're really looking at the role of technology in governance. And you can say that the Chinese have taken it to another extreme with their social scoring. So it's not just in social media, it's actually using technology, which is surveillance in the way. I mean, I'm sitting here in East Germany, so there were Stasis all around. There's been use of technology to watch people, but at the level that we're seeing with China, it is really unprecedented. And with COVID, there's been a lot of fear in Western Europe that as we've been using corona tracking and with the internet, that we might be middle class, but we're not free because we're being watched all the time. And so I think you can't separate any of these discussions around the decline of democracy with fears around or the surveillance of the role of the state, or the state which might become a business, that the business is in cahoots with the state. So it's a really different time, and it's obviously we look to history, but it's never been this connected, and we've never been this surveilled.
Well,
Agreed.
if I could echo that one real fast. What we're seeing also is fundamentally different from anything that George Orwell ever anticipated. We're entering an era of really transnational authoritarianism. There's the UN Charter says that you shouldn't mess with the internal affairs of another country. Sometimes that's interpreted as if you're saying things about that country, if you're communicating things about that country that could impact them internally, especially if you say that online, it's posted. And so some of those countries want to know what you're thinking, and they want to either, they want to discredit you if you're thinking the wrong thoughts and going to say the wrong things about them online, or they want to build you up because you're a fellow traveler of some sort. And we've never had to deal with transnational authoritarianism, the idea that they're going to reach across state lines and try to oppress people outside their countries. And that's a real challenge.
Well, if I could comment on that, Julie, on two levels. First, very personal level. And for the very reasons, Rick, you're talking about, I have to be very careful what I say, because we have worked very closely in recent years with a number of people in China. And the last time I have had any kind of meaningful conversation on email or WhatsApp or phone was over a year and a half ago. And that is operating at both sides, which means I live in Minnesota in the United States. I have to worry in St. Paul, Minnesota, about the surveillance capability of the Chinese government in China, on the other side of the world, taking action against my friends. So for me to have a sense of responsibility towards my friends, I have to self-censor. Now they're already self-censoring by not getting in touch with me. I am reluctant to get in touch with them because I don't know who's listening. About 2 years ago, it was a weird experience for me. So I called up a particular person on the phone. He had not replied to my emails for a couple of months. And I thought, maybe he's sick, he's an older person. So I called him up. Somebody picks up the phone on the other end, and there's silence. And I say, so-and-so. I say, Joe, this is Steve. And then in a very sort of weak voice, I hear, I'm not well. I'm staying at home. I'm not going to work. I'm under the doctor's observation. My wife is taking care of me. And when I start to hear, I think clicking in, like Rick, your experience in Afghanistan is, there's a third party in this conversation, right? And so what do? Do I hang up? And he starts to say a few things very metaphorically, very elliptically, in a very Chinese way, which I can't quite interpret because I don't know all the references. But I came out of that thinking about, here I am in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the United States, and my life is being controlled by an authoritarian system across the world. Yeah. And this is only as other governments pick up this technology, I can just see this metastasizing.
Yeah, what is the role of American tech companies as well? We've seen in the news that LinkedIn has been taking down profiles under pressure from China. We also saw
the Navalny case, right? Where there was the opposition candidate Navalny, or activist really, I think, had an app in Russia that was to help people find candidates who actually had a decent chance of beating a Putin-backed candidate. And the Russians basically said the app was illegal and made Google and Apple take the app off their respective app stores. And they did.
I saw one of the comments in the chat about, okay, so what can we do? Most simplistically, I think we have to operate, if we can, on two levels. One, we have to operate on the level of culture and ideas, which if you don't speak another language and you don't know another culture, it's kind of hard to do. But I think it's an ethical obligation of people who care about democracy to learn about the cultures, to learn about other people, to be able to engage with them in the context of their national character, as Rick was saying. The second thing is materialistic, the investment side, economics. How do you create, for self-interested reasons, by let's say the Chinese, a certain degree of space for other Chinese because it's in the economic interest of the party? Or how do you create, I mean, the classic rise of industrial capitalism in Europe, or the middle class in England through the Puritan Revolution down through the 18th century, the growth of private power did have a long-term impact on controlling the concentration of power in the state.
Well said. We have some questions in the chat. Paul has asked us to compare the systems of the intersection of slower democratic processes and the urgency of action needed on climate in the next decade. That's from Lisa. Lisa, did you want to dive into that?
No, I mean, it's a real question I have around the urgency we need over climate and the incrementalism we've seen through our democratic structures. We're about to have COP coming up, as you know, in Scotland, and the writing's on the wall on the warming of the planet and a potential climate catastrophe. And democracy, usually by design, is slow and inclusive and built in these election cycles that don't necessarily match the needs that we have in our societies. But one of the things we've seen with COVID at Apolitical is governments beginning to move faster than they ever have before. So there's some positiveness. We got pretty dystopian, but can I just take us from dystopia to possibility? And I appreciate Steve talking about, what can we do about it, and Nigel talking about practical. One of the interesting trends that I see going on in Europe, a bit more than in the US, but I think it's happening in lots of places, is on one hand, I think most of us are playing defense. We want our democracy. Like, I've been in conferences where we need to stop the backsliding. We need to protect how democracy has been. And remember, for a lot of people, democracy hasn't worked so well for them. I mean, maybe it's protected their rights and they can vote, but the delivering on the democracy, the improving of their lives hasn't been working. We've seen the middle class shrinking. It's been difficult, and people's rights being eroded in places like the United States, where voting rights are being taken away right now in a democratic space. And in Europe, I'm seeing, and this is no utopia here, but I'm seeing sort of how do we have more democracy and what is too much democracy? And I just wonder if we're missing, back to the culture and ideas, Steve, if we're missing the proactive romance that we want. Have we thought about what we want democracy to be in this technology space and how we need to change that? Like Ray Bradbury said, human beings start off with the romance before it becomes reality. And I don't know many of us talking about what that romance novel is towards democracy for the 21st or 22nd century. And that's the sort of conversation I have, because I know we don't want what we're seeing in a lot of places, but what do we want instead? Is it enough to go back to a time when the Capitol wasn't being invaded because it wasn't working for a lot of people then? So I'd just be curious to hear from the panelists, what's your romance? How do we want democracy to update and change?
Well said.
If I can come back quickly, a thought experiment for everybody. In the United States, for example, what if our antitrust laws had been scrupulously applied as they were once done, just on market share, so that we never would have allowed the FANGs to develop? The attempt by Facebook to buy various other companies in order to grow its market share would have been stopped by the government. And instead of having 3 or 4 major players, what if we had 15 players? And they each had different politics and different cultural orientations and different economic incentives? Would that not be a much more fertile ground for a stable democracy than having to worry about just a few major actors, because we have control over things like antitrust law.
Rick, could you respond to Lisa's question on the room?
Well, so I'm thinking through the antitrust law thing. Sometimes we need antitrust law applied to political parties because we have a duopoly. To Lisa's question about what an ideal democracy looks like, I kind of go back to conversations I've had with people who've been elected to Congress and how much they absolutely hate it. We have this system now where if you get elected to Congress, you're not allowed to do anything. You're supposed to sit there and fundraise for your first term or two. They don't listen to you. You have no policy input. In our democracy is not a direct democracy. We don't vote on issues. We're supposed to select some smart people because 435 people in the House is enough smart people for them to come to a reasonable conclusion if they're allowed to use their brains. But essentially, over the years, we down select to the most partisan people who are willing to stay in that fairly awful process of getting enough seniority to matter. And then at the end of the day, you've got about a dozen people at the top who basically remember nothing but their grudges, who just fight with each other all day. And that's not really what it's supposed to be. So I don't know how we get away from the gerontocracy model that we have. It's a highly partisan gerontocracy model. How do we break away from that and get more involvement by the 435 people who there's a lot of brain cells in Congress that are not being used, right? Can we find a way to actually use them? Because if we did, I think we would get much better policy.
I see there's a question from Isabella on ESG and how that reacts. I have two personal responses to it. One is very cynical, which is that ESG is just a lot of talk. If they say $14 trillion of asset money is being managed under ESG criteria, show me what an S criteria is, show me what a G criteria is. When we're talking about democracy, to me, we are talking about S and G. We are talking, all the conversation we've had here from Lisa and Rick and others, we're talking about social factors, we're talking about governance factors. We haven't even gotten into things like the rule of law, independent judiciary, et cetera, et cetera. I think what is needed is intellectual leadership, and perhaps the ESGX group, Nigel, can help with this, putting a lot of more meat on the bones of the S and the G. What do you need in terms of S? Going back to Rick's comments about what did Afghanistan need 20 years ago in terms of S, in terms of G? And I would add, given my experience in other countries, at the lowest levels of society, not this government in Kabul, but in all the local communities around the country. Anybody have a list? I mean, we Americans try, and the Europeans, we're both in this together, Lisa. We never came up, it seems to me, with a sort of an S and a G program for the people of Afghanistan, which would empower them at the level of individuals, families, and local communities. So that's sort of the sad, cynical side. The other side, very quickly, is that if we did that work, we could build stronger democracies. And finally, Lisa, very briefly, for the ideal, I mean, the other year, I sort of reread a number of the Federalist Papers, which was what, 1789? 3 guys, basically, in the United States. I mean, the idealism they had for a constitutional democracy was pretty good. But as Nigel just said, we in the United States have degraded away from that ideal. Why don't we just take that simple ideal and make it work?
Yeah, so ESG is a great starting framework, but clearly there's a lot more we can do. And all the greenwashing in the press, does anyone want to speak to that?
I mean, I'll just to add a little to Steve's cynicism, skepticism, I don't want to overstate it, on as someone who's raised money for Apolitical. We're a for-profit company that has a foundation. So co-founded this global learning network, Julie, that you talked about, to help governments deliver on democracy, 21st century. And now I run our foundation, which does our political work. We talk to a lot of impact investors And I don't even know what that means anymore. It's a bunch of people running around talking about impact. You know, they're going to fund a climate not fund. And what they do is they fund food delivery on bicycles because it's carbon neutral. That's just a quick make money business where you underpay immigrants to deliver your food. So I just think there's a lot of BS in the investment space, and people are like trying to feel good or capitalizing on wanting to feel good, but it's crap. And I just really hold ourselves accountable to what are the real values you want, and don't let the investors build SPACs or whatever you're going to do to make a lot of money. If it's bullshit, it has to be really grounded in these societal goods if you're going to claim that that's what you're doing. I swore. Was that bleeped?
So I think that
we will bleep
it's a good. No. Well, I think it's a solid point. I think one of the no, I just lost my train of thought. Never mind.
I'll
Steve,
just
you're
jump in for a moment because Lisa was very vehement about a point of view, heavily skeptical. There's a mix of incremental and transformational change, and some of that is positive and some of that is negative. One of the things in support of Lisa's point of view is when you actually rate the corporations, we rate 10,000 corporations globally in the work that we do at HIP. Most of those are negative impact. To operate a publicly listed enterprise is to be extractive of people, extractive of planet, and extractive of trust. And so that's a big challenge. Now, there are positive corporations that are building products that are alternative meatless proteins, that are bringing renewable energy, which we should have done 100 years ago. The electric car industry actually was very vibrant in the early 1900s. And then lost out to the internal combustion engine. So there is a big investment and allocation to make. And there's also missing information. So I think one of the challenges is in the absence of information like environmental information, and the absence of not just COP26, which is coming up for nationwide commitments to reduce emissions. There's limited environmental information to make better decisions on emissions and air and water. And these are roles of governance systems, like the EPA was put on pause or even regressed during the last US administration. Whereas like in Germany, there is sort of an open market to buy your own energy. So I think some of the rulemaking of the governance systems is really important, both to help promote transparency of what's really happening in the world, how to focus people on what problems need to get solved and what solutions are possible, how to fight anti-corruption so that true solutions can come to market and not protect monopolies that are facilitating deeper problems. And so capital can actually be used, including in things like the muni bond market in the US, as well as equities. They can be used to reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. So I just wanted to chime in on that, and that, capital can be used for good.
Sure can.
That was that's actually the point I was about to make until my mini stroke there. Basically, the question with ESG, what are people trying to achieve? And sometimes you see very, very small, active ESG funds cherry picking stocks, and they're probably effective at making sure that more capital is going to at least the general sorts of stocks that they're hoping for. But the tiny focus doesn't necessarily create very strong incentives, because it's what, from an incentive perspective, you would say it's an approach that lacks credibility, because people can't depend on receiving more money if they take the sorts of steps that the investors would like them to take. And how to build a strong incentive model, I think, is central to having impact, right? And that's something which Julie and I have talked a lot about. And if you go back, the hallmarks are basically, you want a system that's very simple. You want it to be very transparent. You want it to be basically automatic, which argues actually for a passive approach. And you combine those things together so that people have certainty. You want people to have certainty that if they take certain actions, they will be rewarded. And if you create all those things, you have an incentive structure that's credible.
Yeah, I might just jump in and add into that, because I'm picking up on Lisa's point about effectively a lot of greenwashing. There is a lot of money flowing into ESG related funds, and these bars here are quarterly fund flows from Morningstar, close to $250 billion per quarter now. But an awful lot of that money is applying frameworks which don't really relate to performance in any particular sense, either linking or really showing what the or the impact performance is, let alone linking to that to any kind of financial return. And what Paul's doing is providing that quantification, but that is still much more the exception than the rule. And so a lot of this money is, absolutely is greenwashing, I think, and is criticised because there's no link between impact and performance. And of course, no one's trying to measure that. So it's sort of unsurprising. The other part of the story, and I was going to share, this is my favourite share price, and this is slightly out of date because it's from a little while ago, but this is an impact investment management business that has got a pretty robust process and has delivered really good returns for its investors. And this is its own share price, which starts behind me at about 30 cents in 2013 and ends this chart a couple of months ago at nearly $10. And last time I looked, it was a bit above $10. So that, again, it's a micro example, small company, about $5-6 billion of funds under management now, showing that if you connect these things, it does work in terms of driving both impact and performance, but this is still very rare.
Let's bring it back to the social and human capital parameters. Go ahead, Steve. Yeah, and
I wanted to respond to Jessica Margolin, because I thought her question gets to something very important. And as if you see in the chat, is there a theory of change around the development of or regression of democracy? I just want to make a comment that I'm quite concerned that we're not operating at the level of theory particularly well these days. We're really good on ideals and we're really good on the collection of data. But what's the theory of how values, structures, economy, governments, elites, elections, courts interact with each other? I mean, it's a systems approach, and where the leverage points, where the feedback loops. There was another comment, I think, from someone from India saying, all right, so India, massive country, terribly important country. If you wanted to sort of work more on the SDGs or something like that, where would you start? That to me is some kind of a theory question about how India works. And I think, again, that the importance of ESGX is to provide forums like this where people can come together and start saying, okay, maybe we need better theory. Who's out there? Who are the thinkers? Who are the writers? Who are this, that, and the other thing? And putting together a community, Lisa, which you seem good at, around theory building. I mean, I know it's abstract. It may sound academic. People want immediate action. But what's the old phrase? If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there.
Yeah, and more transparency into the data and understanding how the money is flowing. Rick, you have a good example of making the laptop decision, the laptop bag.
Oh, yeah. Well, essentially, if you want to look at the GDP weighted democracy score, right? You can say, hey, I'm going to go buy a laptop bag on eBay, right? What country should I buy it from if I want to best improve the global democracy score, GDP weighted, right? And it turns out that India actually isn't that bad of a spot, especially if you're really concerned about Asia, because they have a reasonable democracy score by Asian standards, and they have a high velocity of money. So I mean, there's different ways of making purchasing decisions rather than investment decisions if what you're trying to do is advance democracy.
Julie, could I get in, I would just bridge a little bit? And Steve, I really appreciate the systems approach. Like, how do you get from the thinking to the practical implementation? I like building those bridges between the ideas to action. We've been going around for the past 7 years asking, what does the 21st century public leader need? So both civil servant as well as the political leader. And the number one skill that we hear from people inside and outside of government is this ability to think think via a systems lens and intended, unintended consequences, and really have that, which is very hard, right? Because we break down things into silos because it's easier to wrap our heads on. And then we work in our silos because we get our identities from those silos. And this need to sort of not silo break a bit is like kind of a bit jargon, but to silo connect these things to one another, which is why I'm so happy to be part of this conversation, because here we are talking about within the investment space and democracy. And what I do on a day-to-day basis is build capacity in governments and then build capacity in politicians. And I just want to leave something, we don't have to talk about it, but I just want to posit at something I've been thinking about, just back to the politics space. My sense is one of the reasons why we are in the situation we're in is partially because of all of these trends that we've been talking about. So technology and surveillance and globalization, and maybe the failure of trickle down economics. You know, there's a lot of stuff that we can look at theory and what's worked and what hasn't. Climate change, all of these things. But I posit in the era of social media in particular, or media, we've seen some questions around this. Oftentimes you just see the best tactical candidate win. It's not even about dogma anymore, not even about political parties anymore. You have a very charismatic candidate who, or just a candidate who doesn't screw up. And it looks like people are for that party when really they were just really good at running a campaign. And I think that happens more than we think, that you get in an era of made for TV. I ran for president on a reality TV show in America. So I've spent time sort of thinking about the role of sort of media and how one portrays itself. So sometimes I think we're reading things into elections. Oh, people want authoritarianism. That can be true in some places, but other times you just get a better candidate. You just get a better run campaign. I would argue here in Germany, Olaf Scholz is going to take over. We'll see in the coalition talks, because he ran a good camp. He didn't screw up. Where Annalena Baerbock, she admitted, like, charismatic and young, but like found some falsehoods. It really wasn't about a green or non-green agenda. It was about the quality of candidates. So I just don't want to read too much in. Sometimes it's just bad tactics can lead to democratic decline.
I think that, you know, there's an old saying in boxing that style makes fights, right? And Donald Trump was an incredibly ungainly candidate that nobody was ready for. Yeah. He was a surprisingly capable campaigner, and he pulled it off in 2016. So yeah, I mean, honestly, he didn't really have that great of a background for governance, you know, but he could campaign.
Exactly.
Go ahead, Steve.
It was a sort of question from Nigel about, do we have any thoughts for the audience and others as to what people can do in their own lives, wherever they might be? And I've tried to reflect on that a bit, and I got a couple of things, Nigel. One is, I think it depends on which society you're in or which society you want to influence. If you're in a quote unquote, more or less democratic society, there's one sort of system of agenda, one improvement to preserve. If you're in sort of a middle range of a quasi, the Thailand, I was very much involved in the 80s and early 90s, that you had something called half democracy. So like one half was sort of the military and their cronies, the other half were some political parties. Well, the effort there among myself and some friends was, how do you get half democracy to evolve towards more democracy? And then you've got the really autocratic system. If you're in Russia or China or some of these other places, Belarus, Lithuania, Venezuela, where I'd say there's a very strong democratic movement among the people, but it's checked by the military, economic elite, and the police. So one thing I think is ask questions. And this may come from my background as being a law professor and the Socratic method. And it's fallen out of favor. But I think if you ask people questions rather than tell them the answer, even in places like Russia and China, what I try to do, it's just sort of a personal thing, is ask a question, or with a lot of my very conservative Sunni Islamic context, I say, by the way, what if we interpret the word ijtihad in Quran in this way? And, you know, and then if it works, you begin to see people's minds moving, and as their minds move, then their speech changes. As their speech changes, their relationships change. So asking questions of people, and then Lisa, to your point about consequences, on the wherever we are with our political power, economic power, to think about where do we have little purchase or leverage? And are we contributing to basically the maintenance of a status quo of sort of cronyism and rent extraction? Or can we create more autonomous social power, religious communities, or economic power, a little company as opposed to a big company? Anyway, those are just some thoughts.
Yeah. What else could people do, Lisa or Rick? What else was?
Well, I mean, is what obviously it's partly skin in the game, but it's partly also because literally it's what I wanted. I basically in 2020 got sick and tired of authoritarians. I was like, I'm sick of these guys. I had enough. And, waiting for federal agencies to go do something about these authoritarians, it's never going to happen. So I was like, let's just take away their money, right? Let's just take away all the authoritarians' money. And then they can't be authoritarian nearly as well because they won't have any money, right? And that's why we went and created the Democracy Investments ETF to literally move money from authoritarians to democracies, because just don't give the authoritarians money. That's my angle.
Lisa?
Yeah, well, Steve, you come at it from a Socratic point of view, and I come at it from a sort of behavioral science influence point of view, but the answer is the same, is ask people questions, like deeply, sincerely ask questions over and over again, and maybe spend time with people who have different political views than you have to do that to get in that space. My brother owns an RV dealership near Everett, Washington, and I spent the summer in Eastern Washington in RV parks with a lot of people who have different perspectives on what is good and bad politics. And I just asked a lot of questions, didn't pretend to lord over them with my ideas about democracy. What I will say is there's one thing you all can do is quit saying all politicians are bad and corrupt. It's not true, and it doesn't help us get the good people in. If you keep making demons out of people running for politics, you will get only demons running for politics. So we really have to change our narrative on that and celebrate people, but also realize they're humans and they're going to screw up. Number two, it sounds small, but get involved in a local political campaign. It's incredible if you get involved in local politics. You talked to Rick, you talked about people in Congress hating their jobs. Talk to mayors or city council members where they're close to the people. It's pretty darn awesome. I mean, I've been a public servant, a political appointee. We change people's lives together with communities, with taxpayer dollars, working with businesses. And you see the fruits of what happens in a good democratic system when you can actually deliver on democracy. And you're like, that's why we have democracy. It's not about voting. It's actually reflecting a mandate that the people helped co-create. Maybe even run for office. If you have a business, really lean in. I've seen some people in the chat on using your whole value chain as a way to talk about civics and engagement in democracy in the broadest sense. And for those innovators out there, there's awesome stuff going on at that romance of what we want democracy to be. There's some cool stuff going on with radical exchange, with quadratic voting, sort of how to use technology in new ways to understand sentiment. There's lots of listening and doing group work with communities, co-creating mandates outside of political parties, getting new political entrepreneurs in the scene. So there's a lot of everything from drop the full cynicism and repeating it all the way to getting involved in some of the bleeding edge of where democracy, I think, can go to be more inclusive and faster and more effective.
Well said, Lisa. And how are you recruiting those the new wave of energy? How are you finding those new entrepreneurs?
Well, what's interesting is we have a bunch of categories of people. So you have people who have bumped up against the climate movement and said, wow, I can't actually change the way we buy our power from this good supplier or bad supplier unless I have control over the budget, unless I get into the procurement. So I better go from standing outside and waving my placard to going inside and building the coalition. So a lot of people bump up against power to make the change. Community organizers don't come from maybe the place of protest as much, but this is the opportunity to move from the mom on the street to the mom on the school board to the mom in Congress to maybe the mom president at some day. And then you also see a lot of entrepreneurs who are I want new business models. I want to think about ESG. I want to build this into my business model. I'm not waiting to get rich to be philanthropist. I want to build in democracy and social good. So a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of community activists, and a lot of just political activists who are moving into the space. And they're not hard to find, actually. They're raising their hand. I think the biggest challenge we have in politics is sorting out the people whose egos are in it for the wrong reason. So we do a lot of, pedagogy and a lot of work, like how do you find people who will compromise? How do you find people who have done the work on their own personal leadership, that they're not like fulfilling their dad's dreams, right? Like this real deep psychological work. And a crazy trend, we're mapping all the political training institutes around the world now, or most of them. And like the big trend in Europe right now, give political candidates coaches to help them develop their leadership. That's like a breakthrough innovation in 2021. Imagine this happened in the business sector so long ago, and it's just beginning to come into a wave in political candidacy in places like Europe that tend to be a little bit more open-minded to some of this stuff. The US has been a little bit further ahead in this. I founded my first political training institute 25 years ago, so I've been seeing sort of how these trends run. But I'm bullish on the possibility of getting a new wave of citizen politicians who aren't separate from thinking about these things, thinking about the markets as a force for good, thinking about culture and upstream, all these things we've talked about.
Thank you, Lisa. Go ahead, Steve.
I'd just like to emphasize, because I was thinking about it earlier, pick a word that Lisa just said and broaden it. The concept of citizen. Democracy, I mean, classically going back to, to Athens in the Western, is related to the notion of who is a citizen? What are the rights, responsibilities, duties, actions, powers of citizens? Do we really think of ourselves as citizens? If a company sees itself as a citizen, what does that mean? What are the obligations of citizenship? I don't hear a lot of talk about that anymore. And that might be a way of picking up on what Lisa was saying, of engaging ordinary people who see themselves alienated from both politics and government. And we say, why do you feel alienated? You're a citizen. The whole structure basically depends on you. You're the foundation. You're the rock. What are you doing? And that gets back to you start talking about Minnesota and what I discovered years ago. When I came to Minnesota years ago to be dean of a law school, there was a marvelous young woman there, Jennifer, who was working on legal education for high school kids. And one of the things that she told me was that in Minnesota, under the law, civics civics was basically taught by the coaches, because the coaches needed to have some sort of academic thing in order to get more money and become part of. So we have high school coaches who basically care most about baseball or football or tennis or something like that, teaching our future citizens what it means to be a citizen. It was a void, it was a vacuum. And I couldn't understand why a society that cares about its democracy, I'm sorry, I mean, coaches are great people, but wouldn't you want somebody who sort of like Lisa lives and breathes, the quality of our government, things like that? Nope. We're doing a terrible job in America about citizenship and civics.
Yep. Agreed.
Well, the one caveat, though, I think a lesson I learned from the Afghan stuff has been how everybody jumped in to help. Right? They're like, this isn't America. This isn't how we do things, and everyone jumped in, both sides of the aisle. The people I work with come from all sorts of random backgrounds, and they're trying to get people out because they feel it's our responsibility. They're not waiting for the government because they feel that as a citizen on some level, it's their duty. And it's interesting that it's not just us, the Canadians. We've been working side by side with the Canadians a lot. And it's weird that we kind of have like a sort of almost joint citizen semi-concept with the Canadians, because we share so many values, practically indistinguishable, half the time. So I think that there is an element of that does exist fairly strongly. We do have a national identity. We're quite capable of pulling together. And when you do, you can't even tell which party people are in, right? They're just working as hard as they can. And frankly, it's been very impressive. I'll tell you that one person that people do not know as part of this effort, because she's been behind the scenes, because people believe that she would be a lightning rod if she was public, has been Heather Nauert, the former State Department spokeswoman who's on Fox News. And I know that there are a lot of people on our team who are Democrats. When Heather showed up, we're like, throw her out, right? And Heather's been working behind the scenes, working her butt off. She's been amazing, right? Because it's not a partisan issue, and not everything needs to be partisan.
Well said. And what a great way to wrap up with a positive story of people coming together. I want to thank all of the panelists for your great insights today. It's been quite the discussion. Please share, for all of the attendees, please share this with your friends who weren't able to make it. It'll be on YouTube and on the ESGX panel. And I'll turn it back over to Nigel and Paul for the Green Jobs Report. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Julie, for bringing all of us together. And to Lisa, Rick, and Steve, thanks for your deep insights. And very passionate, very emotional, because it's about how we're governed and how we select to be governed. And earlier in the chat, there was a question of, do people choose to be governed in a democratic way or choose to be governed in an authoritarian way? And that's an interesting psychology question and sociology question. And we're in the middle of seeing that play out, seeing whether that plays out over years, decades, centuries, or millennia. All right, so now's the time. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you still have time, watch now or watch later for the monthly Green Jobs Report. And today, democracy was so important. We put that first instead of the Green Jobs Report. But I think what you'll see here is some interesting evolution. And so Amir Khalegi, who's an employee of HIP Investor, but a fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And Dr. Fadel Kaboub will join us during the discussion as well after the Green Jobs Report presentation. We're going to cover what's happening in the jobs market, what's more green, what's less green. And so Amir, take us through it, and I'll chime in with some observations along the way.
Perfect. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. And before doing that, I just want to comment on how wonderful the discussion was from all of our panelists. I'm sure not only myself, but the people viewing today came away with a lot to think about. So that was a very engaging conversation. And yeah, thanks for coming on. That was a very awesome conversation. So hopefully we always provide material information, but this one's going to be a little bit hard to follow up just with how great that was. So we'll do our best. Here we go. Okay. Everything is displayed correctly? Everyone can see? Perfect. So thank you for those of you who can take the time to stick around for this Green Jobs Report. It will be somewhat of an abridged one, then we can get to the discussion afterwards. So for those of you who are not familiar with our Green Jobs Report, we provide data-driven insights on greening the economy. We do this by pairing human impact and profit ratings that rate company data, and we cross-map it to industry data. These human impact plus profit ratings are based on 7 impact metric pillars, or 7 human impact plus profit pillars that look at material metrics on health, wealth, earth, equality, trust, products and services, and management practices. Currently, HIP has over 2,000 US rated companies that we use to cross-map to industries within the current employment statistics survey, which is a survey that is ran by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. By using employment weights, we weight each company, or we map each company to its respective industry, and then are able to give it a weighted industry HIP rating. These HIP ratings span from 0 being most extractive and 100 being the most net beneficial or green. We can see the 3 tiers that we have here: green, slightly extractive, and extractive. Due to the weighting, the current ceiling for the HIP ratings is 75. So green is a HIP rating from 50 to 75. Slightly extractive is 25 to 50, where extractive industries rate from 0 to 25. So with that being said, we can move on to see the employment trends for each of the buckets spanning from—
And Amir, a quick interruption. I think you're showing like the presentation view. So if you could just hit the like full screen view, that would be super.
Let's see here. I'm gonna try to—
Yeah, just maybe hit end slideshow and then hit escape or end slideshow and then in the bottom right. Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
This is okay?
Oh, yeah, so just in that bottom right, there's a little screen. So to the left, right there. Great, go for it.
Is it doing it again or no?
All right, we'll just run with it. Go for it.
Okay, sorry guys. Sometimes, let's see, this is it.
Great.
Is this better?
Perfect.
Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Sometimes PowerPoint updates and whichever screen it comes up on becomes a technological catastrophe sometimes. But regardless, focusing on the graph in front of us here, it is looking at the various HIP rated buckets and looking at the employment trends since the start of the pandemic around February 2020. So across the recovery, greener jobs have been more stable and were the least impacted by the initial reduction of the lockdown. So we can see here that from March to April, that there was around 20 million jobs lost, and proportionally, the greenest bucket was the least affected, and it remained the most stable throughout the entire recovery. Recently, if you guys have joined us before, especially in the summer months, the leisure and hospitality industry had been powering the gains, job gains, and the industries that are within the leisure and hospitality are mostly rated in the slightly extractive 25 to 50 HIP rating bucket. And due to the consistent gains in that super sector industry, it has just recently overtaken the proportional gain for that bucket as compared to the most green bucket, 50 to 75. So we can see here that over the months of June to July, there is a reduction from the February 2020 level of the greenest bucket of a 2.86% reduction from the February 2020 level. Slightly extractive is below by 2.21%, whereas the extractive industry is still lagging by 4.61%.
And Amir, I think you're going to highlight some of this, but it's interesting that it's not just a 1 month quirk, that it looks like for a second month in a row. And I think later you'll show that high contact industries are some of the biggest recovery. Right. And so yeah, look forward to that. But it's this, you know, is this a new trend or not? And are we building back better or not?
I think that we are building back to the original jobs that we had, where we had an opportunity to transition to a labor supply to more sustainable jobs, better paying jobs through just policy work that we could have initiated through all of the other presentations that we've had. We've shown the possibility of what could be done for transitioning this labor supply that was unemployed from the COVID-19 crisis. But for those of you who have followed us consistently since April, we have seen substantial gains in the high contact industries, which would be the leisure and hospitality, travel accommodation, airlines. And the leisure and hospitality sector actually for the past 4 months has averaged 350,000 jobs gained. And that is the leading sector that is driving the gains. And we can see here, you know, by the next slide, industry leaders and laggards. For the past 4 months, what has stayed the same is restaurants and travel accommodation in terms of the respective gains, both being in the leisure and hospitality sector. These are just more granular deviations of the super sector itself. So looking here, we can see the employment change from June to July for restaurants was 254,000 gain, net change. And travel accommodation, we see that it's 63,000, and recreational industry such as amusement parks is 35,000. In terms of industry laggards, losers, whatever you may call it, we see that building material and supplies dealers had a reduction of 31,000. Insurance carriers had a reduction of 8,000, and grocery stores had a reduction of 5,000. Something to be said, though, is that it'll be interesting to see the granular data for August. The reason that this data is 2 months back, if for those of you who are unfamiliar, is that the CES data provides a granular cut of information for the industries that are 2 months back, although with the jobs report that is released on the first Friday of every month, that will give less granular information for the employment change over the last month. So August data is available, but it's not at the granular level that we use for our report. But what I'm trying to get at is that the significant gains that we had been seeing since the recovery, coming from this year around like March, starting in March, it's starting to slow down, and we will be able to, track and see why that is happening and what can be done to spur growth, not only to get back to the February 2020 level, because we're still, 18 months out, 5 million below the original employment level. So there's still job seekers out there. There are still people who are displaced by, this ongoing pandemic. And how can we ensure for those who want a job to get a suitable, sustainable, meaningful job, with what?
And Amir, I think one of the other things that you're going to show maybe next is the increase in pay. And so one potentially positive element of building back better is that the restaurant pay or traveler accommodation or recreation are seeing increases in pay. So those human impact ratings should go up as the pay raises take hold.
Correct. So green jobs pay significantly more. This is something that is not a surprise for those of you who have joined us. This is a continual, trend, just by the way that these are cut out. Greener, more sustainable jobs are not only more resilient, but they also pay significantly more as compared to the extractive and slightly extractive industries. Thankfully, though, overall pay, regardless of the cut, is increasing, but we have seen that green jobs have just simply paid more by a very significant amount. So,
and Amir, if you multiply this times 2,000 hours a year, like a 40-hour work week times 50 weeks, it means that the extractive jobs are averaging about just over 50K a year. The slightly extractive ones are 60K a year, but that the greener sustainable jobs look like they're 80+K a year. So the good news is it's increasing in each segment. It's good for workers to have increased pay, but the highest reward for workers is when they can also be in a sustainable company.
Correct. And also too, this is something that is not shown. I like how you pointed that out in terms of assuming full-time, right? This is assuming full-time for both extractive and slightly extractive industries. And that brings up a good point. I don't have the hours our information on this slide consistently, but something that we all know from restaurant work or leisure and hospitality work, it gets the coin term gig. It's a gig job, and it forces the employer to either take reduced hours or having to work multiple part-time jobs to get their full hourly to match the sustainable weekly work of more, I guess, stable jobs or greener jobs. It just becomes more of a gig type employment. And not only that too, it's impossible to get this data out there, but in terms of the compensation and health benefits that would come from less gig approach jobs.
Amir, on this point, I do recall the data for the average number of hours per week for all industries combined. I think it's 36 hours a week on average. Mm-hmm. But for the restaurant industry, when we looked at it last time, it was 26 hours a week. So it doesn't really get you to a living standard that we aspire to, despite the slight increases in wages that we've seen recently.
That's correct.
And follow-up question, because you're having discussions across different countries on pay and labor. Are you seeing any trends there in terms of either pay increases during COVID and labor shortages, or in the proportion of jobs in these different categories?
The labor shortage seems to be mostly an American issue. And I think we can go back to it in the discussion as to what are some of the reasons behind it. But in many parts of the world, most people are, waiting to get back to, the economy operating at full speed, so to speak. And I think one of the underlying kind of messages that we've heard from Amir in this presentation and previous presentations is that we're actually jumpstarting the exact same economic engine, as opposed to using this opportunity to change the engine and build more resilient economy. And what we've been highlighting in this Green Jobs report is that it's a no-brainer. We need to transition to a different engine. These jobs pay better, they're more resilient. They're the jobs that will help us actually make the transition into a higher gear, so to speak, in terms of climate action. These are the jobs that are needed. And unfortunately, we're not there yet, as you can see.
Perfect. I'm going to move on to our next segment of analysis, which Paul had mentioned earlier. We do a cut of high contact versus low contact industry sectors, which is an analysis that is mimicked by the St. Louis Fed, pairing together the occupational survey. So from this occupational employment statistics survey, OES, it contains information on the details upon somebody's work, right? So for example, in high contact industry sectors, it doesn't allow for social distancing. Low contact industry sectors do allow for social distancing. So just due to the nature of the pandemic, it's intuitive to see that there's a higher reduction in higher contact industry sectors. Currently, we are below the February 2020 level by 2.8 million in high contact industry sectors. When looking at low contact industry sectors, we are below the February 2020 level by 1.3 million. But even in
this is fascinating. I'm really, I can't wait for you to describe this, Amir, because there's something happening here that's interesting. Go for it.
So even in high contact industry sectors, the when splicing them up in lower versus higher HIP ratings, uniformly higher HIP rated companies, higher HIP rated industries were more resilient to job loss, whether it be high contact or low contact. We can see here, looking at the high contact, that there was a reduction of 4.6% currently from the February 2020 level. And with high contact industry sectors, we're around 6% below the February 2020 level.
So what's fascinating about this is, I think this is the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, that the high contact industries with higher ratings have regained more jobs than the low contact industries with lower HIP ratings. And so there is a glimmer that more sustainability is coming, maybe through higher pay, maybe through other aspects, but there's a glimmer that that's starting to happen.
And there's also too, like within the industries, and because the way that the roll up happens, it starts at the company level and then it goes, we map various companies to their respective industries, and then the weighting calculation goes through and their HIP ratings for their industry ratings are formed. This is also saying that it could be two industries that have similar context circumstances, but one industry is more attuned to employee health. What can we do to like help transition or help preserve and accommodate for these circumstances that are happening, or what versus another industry is saying, we're just going to cut these jobs. You know, we can't do it. We're not going to try to solve anything else. And when it comes back, it comes back. Regardless, it comes down to the mentality of those business leaders within those industries and the approaches they try to take to solving the problem that is at hand. And what we have as a material metric is that the ones that are higher HIP rated do not lose as many jobs, regardless of high contact versus low contact.
Yeah, Fado, what do you think? This is that's I think the first time we've seen this. We'll see if it continues, but there does seem to be some greater traction in a higher HIP rated company of high contact versus a lower HIP rated company and low contact.
You're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a reflection of the overall trend, the effects of the vaccines kicking in and becoming more available, and the economy reopening. So you see the return of more of the jobs in the high contact service industries, restaurants in particular. So I'm not surprised to see this is happening, but what's important to recognize here is the delay with which these jobs came back relative to when we did the Green Jobs report a year ago, right? In the midst of the pandemic, the difference was just substantial.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So right. Key takeaway though is that even in high contact sectors of the economy, greener jobs remain more resilient to job loss when compared to extractive jobs. So this has always been a very interesting chart to follow as we start even, hopefully in the coming months, we bridge that gap with 5 million and start becoming net positive, and we'll see how even the gains happen in terms of high contact versus low contact industry sectors. So that is something to look forward to in the future, and even more so looking into the future. We have some exciting happenings in terms of our data universe, in terms of the Green Jobs report and the data that we use. So on the forefront, we will be doing a database update, which will be adding double the amount of company data that we currently have. And by doing this, we are going to be integrating this additional company data to provide deeper insights on the industry and their respective industries and their respective industry HIP ratings. We also plan on looking at the metric weight calculations. Apart from that, from doing this, we are going to be able to do a comparison of the old versus new Green Jobs data universe. And we can see, are the jobs becoming hipper as we're adding more company data in? Which way is the economy moving? As we're gaining more information and the murkiness of what's going on in the industry is happening, is it revealing a picture that is more sustainable or more extractive? So, are industries growing in their sustainable practices, or are we building back in the same extractive patterns. So these are going to be questions we hope to answer and provide for not only ourselves but you all as well.
All right. Well, Fadl, I'll invite you to comment on the latest jobs report. Let me just answer one question. Sandeep has asked, is HIP data open country-wise? If you go to hipinvestor.com, you can click on the portal and start a free trial. Check out what's there. And if you email us, Sandeep, then we can have a deeper discussion about it and see if we can answer your question on what you're looking at. It does cover 10,000 companies, global equities across 85 countries. So yeah, happy to have a deeper discussion on it. All right, so Fadl, what do you think? There's some new trends emerging on the Green Jobs Report. Additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think if anything, everything we've seen in the Green Jobs Report since we started doing this work more than a year ago, and the more recent kind of reopening of the economy, bringing more of the extractive jobs back online, I think to put it more in context of what's happening in Washington, D.C. today, in terms of infrastructure debates, in terms of climate action and job creation in the U.S. economy, it's just highlights how badly needed this additional retooling of the economy is, and how important it is not to restrict the retooling of the U.S. infrastructure to traditional infrastructure, as some people see it, but making sure that it's building the new economy that we've been talking about, the greener jobs, the better paying jobs, and the infrastructure in the broadest sense of the term. And here I have to applaud again the HIP framework for including all of the pillars that we aspire to create in a society and in an industry, in any business, recognizing that it's not just the jobs, it's not just the pay, it's not just the bottom line, it's all the additional elements of the ecosystem that we want to have in a company, in a community, in an economy. So to take this to the macro sense, to the debate that we're having in DC, infrastructure is not just roads and railroads and airports. People are infrastructure, childcare is infrastructure, transportation is infrastructure, and this is very important for the lowest paying jobs categories that we've been talking about, because the number of hours that people get are on average 26 hours a week, which means you don't get health, you don't get benefits, which means if you fall behind in terms of payments or debt, or the upward mobility is just not there for you. So it's important when we think of retooling the economies, not just in terms of numbers of jobs and pay for those jobs, but also those additional services that many people have been calling for, childcare, transportation, housing, wellness, mental and physical wellness included as part of the care package that should go with the job. So it just means that we need to double our efforts to do this. Now is the time to kind of take this opportunity to retool the US economy on the economic front, but also on the climate resilience front, because as you've seen from the last IPCC report, we just don't have time to think and plan anymore. This is time for substantial intervention on the decarbonization front, and I think if we don't have a clear vision right now to act on a rapid scale, I'm afraid we're going to be in big trouble. The last thing I want to say, which is many of the objections that you hear on the macroeconomic front and the policy circles, is that this is all going to cost too much money that the government doesn't have. And that if the government continues to spend and borrow, the national debt will increase. Now we're having a debate about, the debt ceiling in DC. And inflation is going to, ravage the US economy. And this is where some of the work that we've been doing in the MMT community is really important, to highlight that some of the inflation that we've been seeing in the last few months is transitory and is related to supply chain disruptions, that will sort themselves out as the economy recovers, which means prioritizing reopening the economy, meaning prioritizing vaccines and getting the pandemic under control globally, not just in the US, is the key to addressing some of the transitory inflation effects. The other components of inflation that most people have been looking at are not going to be an issue for a country like the United States, because the inflation pressure points that we've seen in the US pre-pandemic are in healthcare, in higher education, energy and transportation, and real estate. And those areas, the sources of inflation pressure point, have to do with shortage of productive capacity, which means we need to invest more and build larger capacity in those areas and make those services more accessible. That includes higher education, that includes energy and transportation, ideally doing this by decarbonizing the grid and modernizing the grid. Healthcare, making healthcare more accessible and inclusive, meaning investing more, not less, in healthcare. And these are all jobs that will make the US economy as a whole hipper, to use the hip language here. So the inflation pressure points that exist in the US economy pre-pandemic will be tamed with the kinds of investments we've been calling for to green the economy and so on. So we have to be very careful not to kind of succumb to the fears of inflation and postpone the necessary investments that we need to transform the economy and to deal with climate change.
Great. Well, thanks, Adil, for that deep insight. We're going to wrap up here. Let me just answer Sandeep's question, and then Amir, if you can stop the screen share. And then Nigel will wrap up after I answer this question. Sandeep asks, he's keen to see the trends of companies that rate higher or lower in terms of size, turnover, which I think he means revenue, and employee strength. And his objective is to understand the ability of companies in developing economies to be resilient and ESG sustainable at the same time. And so I'll just give a quick summary, which is larger companies tend to rate better because they actually have more professional systems put in place. Larger companies can change faster because it's easier to change one large company than 10 mid-sized company than 100 small companies. So there is some economy of scale, like we've learned over time. And that the drivers of people, planet, and trust are natural drivers of positive return on investment. So it actually is more sustainable financially and impactfully to pay people appropriately, to treat nature as a two-way system, not a one-way system of turning nature into waste, and to build trust over time. All right, fantastic episode today. So as suggested earlier, please share this online and with your community, and hit the like button. Nigel, over to you for what's coming up on the rest of an amazing 2021 schedule for ESGX.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Paul. I thought there were a couple of great quotes as we went through earlier on. One was, we can't tell people the answers, we have to ask them the right questions. That's what we're continuing to do in the Green Jobs Report too. It is a long, slow journey to persuade people to change, but the good news is there. Another more direct point from Rick was, let's just take away their money and then they can't be authoritarian nearly as well, which I loved. And the thing which got me most was get involved in a local political campaign. This here, of course, is ex-Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who was displaced by a local independent campaign in my own constituency in Australia, which was a wonderful thing to see. So looking ahead, next week, we have got a fantastic episode coming up with Dame Jane Goodall, who is joining us live from the UK. That's the 5th of October in the Americas, the 6th in APAC, and scheduled to be very much friendly for everyone in Europe and Africa, as well as here in the Americas. The week after that, and building on the green jobs and MNT theme, we have a discussion with Fadel Kaboub and Dr. Stephanie Kelton around, in fact, both doctors, let's be fair there, around new economic models for development in the global south and a shift from extractive traditional development development models to something that will be more effective. Looking briefly beyond that, we will have a preview of COP26 and the October Green Jobs Report on the 26th of October. And coming back to democracy again and what you can do to move from advocacy to climate action, what I think will be a really fascinating discussion, 60 minutes to save the world. What can you do in an hour a week or an hour a month to make a real difference? So that is it from ESGX for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. And we very much look forward to seeing you again next week.